everybody. And a special welcome to my Port of Seattle colleagues, Bookdah, Gheisar, and Jay Doran. We're so lucky to have them here with us today. So before I turn the floor over to them, just a quick introduction. So um, they come to us from the Port of Seattle. As folks know, I'm the Seaport Alliance now, but so I consider my Port of Seattle colleagues my colleagues as well. Bookdah is a senior director of our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She helped start this office, which has been new as of 3 years ago, and was our first senior director. Jay was one of, I think, her very first employees, has been there for almost over 2 years. So he has been alongside with her, working together. A couple fun tidbits about these two. Some of you heard at our breakfast on Tuesday. Yes, I'm expecting twins. Bookdah also has twins herself, so I have a lot to learn. She's survived, and they're 22 now, I believe. So I know there is a path to future, and she helps give me that bright light. She does. She has shared with me that she loves to come visit our glorious community of West Seattle on days off, whether it's Alki or Jack Block Park, which is, we all know, great places to spend your free time. And Jay is a fellow West Seattle resident with many of us here as well. Before coming to the Port of Seattle, Bookdah joined us from King County, where she was policy advisor for King County's Office of Equity and Social Justice. She has a long career in this field. We are so lucky to have her expertise. I think for this group today, she'll give a brief presentation and then Q&A, and I think we'll be able to go back to this because of the recording. So great. It's a great opportunity for all of us. Thank you all for being here today. And with that, I turn the floor over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Whitney, for inviting me. I appreciate the invitation to join all of you. Good afternoon, and nice to meet you all. I think you've just heard an introduction about me and Jay, but let me just say that it's incredible what's been happening around the country as racial equity and equity broadly are becoming a topic of many organizations' conversations. And as you just heard from Lindsay, I joined the port just about 6 months before COVID happened. So I joined to create the Office of Equity at the port, and the port had been doing some great work, and it was in different kind of places and somewhat not connected to one another, the efforts and the programs. So I joined to build the office, and of course, 6 months later came COVID, and shortly after, the murder of George Floyd and the racial awakening and uprisings and Black Lives Matter movement, and then economic crisis. So it's been 3 years full of back-to-back kind of crises that have together brought an incredible opportunity for the port to center equity in a lot of our work. And so what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit with you about how we've done that at the port, and to kind of share some general thoughts for others who are considering this work in your businesses. But I want to pause for a moment and ask Jay to introduce himself, and then I will, along with Jay's support, and together offer about 20 minutes of comments, and then pause for some questions, feedback, thoughts, and sort of a mutual conversation between all of us. And while I'm talking, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if something you want me to pause and right then address, or at the end of the 20 minutes, all of that is fine with me. Jay, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Jay Doran. I work with Bookdah as the engagement and communications manager for our office at the port. I have been doing race and social justice work for about 12, 13 years in a few different capacities. I started off as community organizer and have done a combination of organizing, policy work, communications, and been with the port now, like you heard, just a little over 2 years. A lot of my work focuses on training and development of our staff, and their continued education and building their skills and capacity to really do their work with a racial equity lens and to integrate equity into their programs and operations. And also, like you heard, I'm West Seattleite. I've been in West Seattle for about 7 years. I live about a half a mile south of South Seattle College, just off of 16th. So happy to be here with you all today. Excited to talk.
Thank you, Jay. By the way, I live in Rainier Valley, but I come to West Seattle a lot too. So I have a lot of favorite restaurants and places to visit in West Seattle, and a big time supporter of that community. So I'll just start with some slides. And as I said, I really don't want to make this too formal. Please feel free to, I don't think I can see if people raise their hands, but feel free to put questions in the chat, and then, I'll try to keep this to about 20 minutes so that we can talk between us all. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, please, Whitney. Thank you. Next one, Whitney. Oh, beautiful. Okay, so as I said, around the country, a lot of institutions from the very large to medium are all building offices of equity or equity staff. One of the most important things, in my opinion, that the port has done that's made us be successful in our efforts is to envision equity as a cross-cutting horizontal effort that really infuses equity in all of our lines of business. So aviation, maritime, economic development, and corporate are the lines of business for the port, and the Office of Equity in multiple different ways, really like sustainability or safety, works with everyone across the port to make sure that processes, policies, programs, everything that we do is really looked at within the framework of equity. One of the things that we see as we look at equity efforts around the country right now is that often the staff doing equity work are either doing a lot of other things like social responsibility, community efforts, community engagement, outreach, communication. And so equity becomes marginalized within their scope of work, or the people who are doing equity are reporting to the people who report to the people who report to the people who report to the people at the top. One of the things that the port is doing that is very unique is that my position is of one of the 13 executive leadership team members. So I'm at the highest level of the organization and at the table, and really a part of all conversation that's happening at the leadership level. I work closely with the commissioners, and so that equity itself is not marginalized, if that makes sense, because often equity is one of a lot of other things. And as you know, these days, especially, staff are burnt out, they're exhausted, there are so many priorities. And so equity becomes yet another consideration. And this is one of the ways that we try to prevent that. Next slide, please, Whitney. All right, so I think you have to keep clicking for all the words to look to. Yep, keep on going, please. Beautiful. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to start by talking with you all about today is, what is equity? So we kind of divided the conversation in this sort of continuum, if you will. I wonder if someone is willing to sort of to talk here about what diversity efforts do you see in your community that fits kind of awareness and appreciation of differences, bringing diverse voices to the table. What's an example of something that you see in your business or in your community that is focused on this bucket? Is someone willing to raise their hand or just unmute themselves and share an example?
Well, I'll speak up. I work for a credit union, and we've been trying to figure out ways to engage the folks that don't normally engage with a financial institution. And so we have developed some new products to try and do that. And one of them is a co-op lending loan for if anybody's familiar with the Othello Square project in the Rainier Valley, we're the lender behind that. And so, you know, that we're just basically looking at all of our loan products and saying, are there things inherently within those products that prohibit certain members of our community from accessing them? And what can we do to make them more accessible?
Beautiful. Pete, what you just said actually, and thank you for that example. I love that project, and some of what you said fits into equity and some in diversity. So people listening here, what do you think is what Pete just talked about that actually fits in diversity?
I'll take a stab at it a little bit.
Thank you, Nancy.
So I get the honor of working on the board of directors with Verity, so I'm familiar with what Pete's referencing. I think that the awareness and appreciation of the difference is the fact that Verity is connected to this diverse community in Othello and is trying to develop that particular project with those voices impacting the work, even though the voices may be bringing different perspectives. So that's the awareness and appreciation of the difference. One of the loans is focused on the Islamic community. That's a product. And so the structure and the products themselves are a little bit more equitable, but the approach to it, sort of the behaviors behind it, are that instead of saying your religious differences are problematic, we're saying let's meet your religious differences. Let's appreciate it instead.
Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that. Exactly. So, you know, for example, I mean, Nancy and Pete have just laid out a beautiful example. Another example is I worked with Pacific Northwest Ballet for some time around their efforts to increase engagement in communities of color, to be able to recruit kids interested in dance. So they developed an outreach and engagement strategy to schools that had high numbers of kids of color, to be able to go into those schools and tell them about ballet, recruit them to come and to see and to become interested. That's like, those are the efforts to like teach about your work, to do outreach, to engage people and engage in diverse populations. So exactly as Nancy said, in a neighborhood that is very diverse, in a school that's very diverse. So cultural competency, I'll just touch on this very quickly, is that, for example, then if we're sending staff from Pacific Northwest Ballet to go to schools that are diverse and they've never done that before, how do we teach them about the populations? And Nancy just laid out a beautiful example, the bank and its lending practices in Muslim communities. because Muslim communities have strict laws around lending and loans and what percentage and no and interest and paying interest. So just understanding how Muslim communities feel about and practice is really, really important as you do outreach to communities. Then equity. So equity, Pete and Nancy just laid out sort of some examples of, all right, now their bank has reached communities of color, they've reached Muslim communities, and how do we change systems and policies so that the bank might have long-term practices that prevents, I'm not saying Pete, your bank, but our bank might have many processes that prevents people from low-income communities or first-time home buyers or people to be able to actually get a loan. So when you look at how do we change the policies, how do we change the systems so that people have access and increase opportunity, that's actually what equity is. Equity gets to the root causes of issues. So if you imagine social problems, for example, let's say domestic violence, building a shelter for women doesn't get to the root cause of violence, but it is a very important and necessary service. It's critical, must happen, but there has to be organizations that also work at the root cause of violence for us to be able to actually move the needle on issues. So for banks, for example, to be able to bring in diverse populations, but for change to actually come about, you have to think about what are the barriers that historically have been in place and how do we overcome the barriers. I want to pause here and see if Jay wants to add anything here before we go to the next slide.
Not at the moment, but thank you, Bookdah.
Okay, next, let's go to the next slide, Whitney. Okay, so now just keep going. We keep going with the concept of equity still, but we look a little bit at another concept that makes equity really confusing. Is equal the same as equity? So if everyone who came to Pete's Bank had the same access, would that be the same as equity? I want to pause here and, well, maybe let's see if we could read this out loud. I love reading things out loud. Dawn, would you be willing to please read the equality definition here out loud?
Sure. Equality. The same amount of power, opportunities, and resource are distributed to everyone with the assumption that everyone starts in the same place and has the same needs.
Beautiful, thank you. Alice, would you be willing to read the equity definition we use at the port?
Here, equity, the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of communities historically oppressed. Improving equality involves increasing justice and fairness with the procedures and processes of institutions or systems and a fair, intentional distribution of resources.
Thank you, Alice. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry that I have put everyone, I do this a lot when I talk, is put people on the spot. So thank you for being willing to go along with this. And you all should feel free to pass also. But okay, so in this practice of equity, we use a tool, Jay and I, that's called I Notice, I Wonder. So here's the definitions. Then you have a picture that is outlining basically what we're saying with equality and equity. What do you notice and what do you wonder as you look at this? I wonder if a few brave people are willing to tell me, what do you see here?
I wonder if I, as a white male, notice the lack of access that others maybe don't have, and or believe that they do have access. when I haven't asked enough questions.
Beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. Who else? What else?
I noticed the difference in the size of the tires.
Yeah, say more.
The tires in the front top one are all equal, so the people have to adjust to the size of the tires, so they have to fit into that structure. And below, the tires are, the whole bike is a different size, I think, but the tires are different and they're placed differently so that the people don't have to fit into the structure. The structure addresses the people.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that. How about another person, someone else?
I can go.
Yeah.
I really noticed the word assumption under the equality definition is very prominent to me, assuming that we can give a one size fits all solution to everyone and say we've checked the box of equality and access. So the assumption that everyone starts in the same place and has the same needs, that's the biggest thing that stands out to me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you all for that. Exactly. So look at the top picture, as you've all said, the tires are all made available to all, right? You're in a wheelchair, you want a bicycle, here it is. You get to have one. You're older, you're a lot taller, you want a bicycle, here it is. You're tiny, you're short, you want a bicycle, here it is. But below you can see that it is actually designed for the person's need, right? So the barriers to access have been considered, and the person in the wheelchair has a bicycle that is designed to their need and overcomes the barriers that are put in place, so that now well, let me just put it this way. Jay and I just attended a conference last week with John Powell, who is one of the leaders in this field and leads an institute at the University of Berkeley called the Institute for Belonging. And he said, he gave a really beautiful illustration of this. He said that he, is a gardener. He lives in Oakland where there's a lot of sunshine. He gardens, plants vegetables, and he has planted corn, tomatoes, peas, and the corn and the tomatoes are doing really, really well, and the peas are not. And that he's done everything possible to see how could the peas thrive, and he's not been able to be more successful until he's come to the understanding that the peas need a different soil. And so it is, you must change the conditions for the peas to thrive. And it's just not just watering it less, watering it more does not get to the peas' success, but that it actually different conditions that it needs, which is at this, for this example, the soil, if that makes sense. All right, next slide, please. Also, Jay, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. Right.
So I just want to, that image, I think, of the bicycles is helpful because it breaks down the distinction between these two terms in a really simplified way. It's a good tool for that. I think the kind of caveat I want to give to it is it shows a distinction on an individual basis. When we're talking about equity, we're really looking at and trying to address where we see patterns of disparities across groups of people, across communities of people, not necessarily from individual to individual. And so I guess that's the caveat I want to say with this is equity is looking at how communities experience life and outcomes of different communities and patterns we see within and across communities as a way to understand what sort of challenges or interventions or lack of access there is. The last thing I'll say is just in case there was confusion, we're not trying to set up some sort of dichotomy of like equality is bad, equity is good. Simply just trying to draw the distinction out because there are many scenarios in which like an equality approach to something is going to produce the outcomes we want to see. But it's not always the case. Sometimes equality is really lacks the context we need in order to actually create the change we want to see.
Thank you, Jay. All right, so moving on to this slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because in the last 2 years, there has been a lot more dialogue about, we used to say equity, and, we must address all forms of oppression all at once. That, of course, for example, at the Port of Seattle, we have a lot of issues around gender equity because the port industries have been dominated by men in the majority of the fields at the port. And so, of course, gender is an issue that we must address. But what is really important for us is to really lead with race. Leading with race allows us to do a lot of different things, which is to address racial inequities that we have in place, but then to build a model for addressing the barriers that then we could apply to gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, and all other forms of oppression, if that makes sense. So I wanted to see if maybe I could ask you, Jay, now I'm putting you on the spot, but is it possible that you could walk us through this slide, please, a little bit?
If I can find the mute button, there we go. Absolutely. So this is a framework that we've adapted a little bit for you all. This is something that, as Bookdah said, like we communicate a lot at the port in terms of why we at the port lead our equity work with a racial equity lens. And they're more than just these reasons, but to kind of distill it down into 3 reasons, it has to do with our history, with the potential for meaningful, lasting change that can be created through practices and policies, and with the culture, with the culture in which we live. In terms of history, government has played a large role in creating and perpetuating racial inequities since the founding of our country. From things that were really explicit, like mass exploitation of Native Americans and enslavement of Africans and Black Americans, to things that today are often not explicit, often not intentional, but are the result of creating policy with kind of a race, with a race blind lens. An example might be laws and regulations having to do with someone who is formerly incarcerated being able to get housing or employment. Those laws are created without kind of consideration or the context of race. As we know, people in this country that are incarcerated are disproportionately folks of color, disproportionately Black. And so a policy like that is going to continue to perpetuate and exacerbate racial inequities, even though it's not explicit, even though it's not necessarily intentional. So the government, and from our perspective as a government entity, like this historical legacy is really important. I think from a more global perspective, history is really important because of the ways in which through the history of our country, white people have benefited from unearned systemic advantages in comparison to folks of color. And that's where the policy and practice piece comes in. We talk a lot about, like, I think it's really easy to talk about racism and racial equity on an individual level. What one person does to another person, what one person says to another person. It's also a lot easier to see that. But in terms of seeing how these patterns of disparities are created and perpetuated by institutions and policies, it can be a little harder. And when we're able to actually intervene at that institutional level to transform policies and practices, we can create outcomes and results with kind of on a more sweeping level, and create outcomes and results where people of all communities have access to opportunities they need. And then along the same lines, just like Bookdah said, reiterating, this work in terms of policy and practices, it does establish a framework for us to think about, if we're able to address a racial disparity in this instance, we can kind of use a similar framework for addressing issues related to, say, gender or religion or sexual orientation. And then that last piece around why racial equity is so important is, I think it speaks to the first two, but race is it's so ubiquitous in our society. It's something that everyone has. There is this phenomenon in which, in terms of race, whiteness is centered and has become seen in many cases as normal. Again, even if it's not intentional or conscious. And as a result, race is often used as a way to divide us, instead of to build power and unite us to create a future where we're all thriving, a future where we're all living better lives.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jay, for doing that. So we can, see if you have questions about this and about leading with race and why we put race first. We have 3 more slides to go through quickly, and then we could pause. But let me just add one other thing in addition to everything that Jay said. As you heard that in my introductions, I worked at King County, and at King County, of course, there are so many amazing efforts in place and departments, and no matter which department you look at, whether it's about housing and access to housing or parks, clean water, recycling, public health, no matter where you look, by far in every metric that you look at, Black and Indigenous communities are left the furthest behind. And I think that is one of the most important reasons for us to know that we have to lead by race, as we have tried for decades now to tackle equity, and we've tried to improve systems and conditions. And we continue to see that Black communities, Black children, Indigenous families, and children are left behind. So that is to me, one of the most important reasons for us to commit to leading with race. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now all of you are probably maybe in your businesses, such as banks, law firms, etc., thinking about how do you build a culture of inclusion. We're recommending, and this is borrowed from Nonprofit AF. Wu Lee has a blog. If you're not familiar with it, please follow it. It is so fun and informative and smart. And here are like 5 elements that the blog suggests that we wanted to focus on: hiring practices, pay equity, values, communications, and operations. Of course, at the port, the hiring is a huge deal. And we have many components of the hiring process that we're examining and changing. But for other organizations that are possibly smaller, these 2 bullet points, I think, are really an important starting point, where nationally there's a huge dialogue about why it's important for everyone to disclose salaries on job postings and to not hide that. This is an important element of accountability and transparency in this work. Education requirements at the port, of course, we see that there are jobs that have an educational requirement that are not even necessarily connected to the actual job. So why are we adding that? Is it a barrier? Yes, it is. Why are we putting it in place? It's not really clear to anybody why it's been there, but we've just started at the port asking that everyone, before a job posting, reviews again with a new lens, with a new process to evaluate what's the educational level required for a position. Pay equity, analyze gender and race gaps in your current salaries and adjust for them, and provide paid family leave, which again is a national dialogue that is really critical. Spell out your values. Be sure that as an organization, you are value-centered. And if you have a value that is, for example, equity or anti-racism, that you actually center it in all of your conversations. Communications to ensure that language access is centered. A lot of people skip interpretation and translation because there's a cost involved. And as you begin to reach out to the diverse communities in West Seattle, to budget yourself for some translation and interpretation to be able to reach diverse communities. And community meetings, I have to say that is so important, to go in the community, not always expect the community to come to you, and to allow a budget for community meetings, food, childcare, things like that. Operations, contracts with minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, and to ensure that facilities are accessible and welcoming. All right, next slide, please. And I think we're almost there, 2 more slides. Okay, quickly, I just wanted to talk to you about an example of how we've implemented that culture of inclusion at the port. Last year, we conducted 4 massive surveys all at once. To the bottom 2, the employee engagement survey and compensation survey conducted by our human resources department, the top 2 equity assessment and women of color assessment by the equity office. And what you see in the center in the bubble are the buckets of work that came from all of this: compensation and pay equity, equitable hiring, internal promotions and pathways, our Office of Workplace Responsibility, which is actually the office that investigates codes of conduct, and performance evaluation. These are the 5 buckets that were the biggest problems that employees identified through all of this work, where people felt like, policies are not consistent, processes are not ensuring consistent implementations of policies we have in place. So we really highlighted to the importance of really revamping all of these 5 processes, which is a huge amount of work. Every one of these, so for example, from pay equity and compensation or equitable hiring, we are going from outreach to communities, to advertising, to translation, to actually the job description, to everything. Is so much work. And this is kind of an example of what I mean by infusing equity at every step of the way. And the 5 values that you see on the right, trust, respect, communication, recognition, and fairness, is what we're centering in all of the work. So that's what we're doing at the port to build a culture of inclusion. And next slide, please. And I think this is the last one. All right. So as we do equity work, we use the 3 pillars of normalize, organize, and operationalize. Normalize is a lot of work that we do to say, what is equity? What is the language that we use? Why do we center race? What do we mean by it? We do book clubs, we do podcast clubs, we do equity training, so much work at the port to make sure that we're all on the same page. And organize, how do we actually bring all of our employees together and generate and sustain the investment from our leadership and staff to be able to move the work forward. And operationalize is actually where we Then after we've educated everyone, after we've organized everyone, we make sure that equity now happens in everyone's work. Okay, so I think I want to pause there, and Whitney, ask if you would please stop sharing the slides. We went longer than I planned to, but let's use the 15 minutes we have for questions or comments and thoughts from all of you. I'd love to hear from you about what you've heard or some of what we haven't shared, any good work that you're doing that you want to share with everyone else. So just opening it up.
Bookdah, thank you so much for your presentation. And I appreciate both what you and Jay have brought for us to think about and consider. I have a more general question, I guess, and then can get more specific. What strategies are you and Jay and the port using to get individuals, groups comfortable talking about race? And and not only comfortable talking about race and ethnicity, but recognizing differences, and then, as you said so well, working towards that climate of inclusion and making certain that all differences are not only recognized but celebrated. So do you have some strategies that you implement for individuals? I mean, I think we've all heard like, oh, I just don't see color. And so how do you get individuals to not only recognize the differences around them? And saying you don't see color, I think, is very much centered in whiteness, to say, oh, I just don't see the color around me. So what strategies do you use to not only help individuals see color, but to recognize and appreciate that?
Thank you, Janine, for that. I mean, what you've just said is so fundamental in this work, and it's just the foundation of the work, which is what we call normalized, right? In that framework that I just showed you, normalizing equity, it takes a tremendous amount of time. I think it is so important in doing this work in organizations, or even, people talk to me about friends and friend circles or family, where, at family dinners, they have conversations about this. I think it's so important to not leave people behind. The reason that is so important is because if you do that, you keep coming back to that point, right? If we have, let's say, a leadership team at the port of 13 people, and half of us feel that way, are not buying in, and want to keep bringing the conversation of why are we doing this? Why are we even doing this? What's wrong with what we're doing? When you say cultural change, what's wrong with the culture we've had? Why do we have to change? We're all just doing finance work anyway, or flying planes, or giving this and that work. So what's wrong with what we've been doing? We've been doing it for 120 years. So it is so important to take as much time as necessary. And I would say that in the 3 years we've done this work, 2 years has gone into that first step. And it will continue to come back to that. Why? Because it's not a linear process. It's a circular process where, as new people come into the organization, or people who still haven't bought in, and my estimation today is that about 70% of the people at the port have bought into this, and about 30% haven't. And I think that's enough to keep moving forward, but not moving forward with losing sight of that. We have to keep doing it. So some of what Jay does is so many book clubs. Our model of a book club is, we ask people to volunteer to be a book club leader. We select the books, and really important and critical books that allow for meaningful conversations for this work, right? And then people take 8 to 10 weeks to read the books together, and to talk and to talk and to talk. I don't think that you can hit people over the head with these messages because people become resentful, they become more resistant, and to get buy-in, you just have to invest time. And there, of course, this work, our culture sees whiteness as norm. Everything is designed around whiteness. So when we don't see color, we only see whiteness. And so to change that is threatening. And we have to increase people's comfort level for talking about why we have to become more inclusive. Jay, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I would just share, Janine, two things in particular, and I think we're continually trying to learn and adapt and figure out how to meet people where they're at. But two things in particular, in terms of strategies, consistent and usually unified messages from leadership, from the very top of the organization. That's coming not only from Bookdah as an executive leadership team member, but also from the executive director of our organization. And one of the things that that Bookdah and I do is work with our executive director to ensure that he is including what are referred to as equity moments in weekly all staff emails. And these are just like drawing attention to things, current events or celebrations or historical milestones or things going on in the port that really centers racial equity. And in that way is like normalizing this as part of a conversation. And the second thing, I think, speaking to your point, is like talking about race is really uncomfortable. And it's really uncomfortable because so many of us are not practiced in it. And so it is like, to book clubs, to trainings, to things like race-based caucusing, it is giving people the practice to do that. And Bookdah often talks about, like, to use your phrase, Bookdah, like working our equity muscles. Like we have to exercise that like continually in order to be comfortable seeing and naming race, so that we can start to see and name patterns of racial disparities. And it's hard.
Thank you. Yeah, just one more thought. It is hard, and creating that culture of curiosity about others, and then the willingness to persist through the discomfort. So thank you for that.
I can say from my personal experience with the race-based caucusing, when Bookdah first started that, it was a really powerful experience. I didn't know what to expect, and I know, you read interesting things in the news where different perspectives, but it was, for those that have not had that experience, it's incredibly, for me as a white woman, it was very powerful, very, very powerful experience. And so I encourage all of you to consider ways to explore things like that. Just my personal, it's just Bookdah and her team has just done amazing things for the port, and I'm glad that she's been able to be here with us today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lindsay. I think the creating environments for people to be able to talk and not to feel bad or wronged, and for saying what they want to say, and providing the tools and education for people to understand. So creating like committees that bring together educational opportunities, or a caucusing. There's a lot of models around the country for what is now called the White Caucus or People of Color Caucus, where people can get support from other white folks to talk about race, because I think it has been impolite. Most people are, of our generations, have been raised to that, noticing disabilities, naming it is wrong thing to do, and it's better to be race blind. So it's just really undoing a lot of the learning in people's minds and teaching them new things and providing them with tools. Other questions or comments?
I have a question. Do you have any advice or resources for a business to start to review itself to see the ways in which it could be more inclusive? I know that that's probably a blind spot for a lot of people and businesses, but any first step for how to evaluate themselves and maybe change how they do business?
Yeah, I think before I answer that, I'm wondering if some of you all want to talk about that. What are your thoughts about this? How do you evaluate yourself and know if how you're doing?
Well, one thing that the chamber is doing is engaging with Ampersand Community and Nancy Woodland for specifically an equity review and the development of an equity, diversity, and inclusion committee, and learning how to do outreach with anti-racist principles. I'm curious for, and that's us as an organization. I'm curious if anybody else has any advice for how to do that as a business. Like maybe you don't have the ability to work with a consultant. Where would one begin?
What else can people do?
I have a comment.
Yeah, Melinda, go ahead.
Thank you. I have the benefit of working in a space where all of us are Latino, more or less. I have two people who are not. So we can flow into a conversation. It becomes natural because it's a shared experience. At the same time, I recognize different privileges that I have because I am someone who grew up in the United States. And starting a conversation is easier in some ways, but recognizing that there is differences is harder. But I find that if you put a lot of energy and focus onto team building, that we're all here together, that those conversations become more open and we become a little more intimate because we have trust. And so trust becomes probably the largest part of opening a conversation and letting people ask questions and letting people share their experiences. And nothing is truly free of judgment, but at least sharing and having those spaces. And sometimes it's the break room, and sometimes it's after bad news and somebody comes to the office, but there's always something we can learn, and we open those spaces. But I think acknowledging, that those conversations need to happen is maybe even a first step. But I agree with Whitney. I would like to have more resources as well. If there's some places we can look into, like tools that we can try to use to implement.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that. Feel free to put your thoughts or responses to this of what you're doing and what can be done in the chat. I think, getting the question of how are we doing and how could we do better is one where I think you want to be asking of the communities that you're serving, right? You want to know, how are we doing? How can we continue to do better outreach and to broader communities? Today, that broader community is more and more diverse. So you want the input of your employees, of your communities, of your customers in improvements that you make. And really in their input in what those improvements specifically should look like, so that the problems and the solutions are connected to one another, if that makes sense. Because sometimes we find out what a problem is and then we design solutions that are not necessarily connected or doesn't really address the root cause of the problem. So I think you want to stay as close to that as possible. But for beginning steps, some people have money to start with a consultant to do an equity assessment, as Nancy and Whitney have called it. And that's often looking at the 5 components that we just showed on the slides. But I think really, as Janine said, starting the conversation, getting everybody on the same page, getting everybody on board to be a champion, an ally, and supportive of the work is so important that that's like, in my opinion, that's like the first phase that should take actually a while to get your leadership, your board of directors, your most important customers or community members and stakeholders on board to be supportive of this work, so that you don't start and then 6 months in, people are saying, this is costing us too much, we shouldn't do this, or next year they're not supportive of it, but it becomes infused and an important part of the work going forward. I know we have to close, Whitney. We have 1 minute. I don't know if you had some thoughts about what your organization is going to do moving forward that you just shared a little bit of, but maybe you want to close with more of that.
Okay, so we have had our kickoff meeting with Ampersand Community, and the next phase of that will be our evaluation and getting Ampersand Community to our committee meetings and our board meetings. So after that will be a series of interviews with everyone who's involved with the organization. So it is very much hearing from the community and getting direct feedback rather than us kind of operating in a silo of how we think we're doing, getting feedback honestly about how we truly are interacting with our community. So that's all I'll say for now. If there are any member announcements, we can go through those and then we will all go about our day. Any member announcements about upcoming events?